I'm Raina Buxton. I'm the creator of short films like Operago and Pharos, and today I'm going to go over 3 different techniques for using textures in Toon Boom. So, technique number 1, static textures. They're very fast, they're easy, and it doesn't take any more time than just adding solid color. It's a great bang for your buck as long as you're able to plan for it properly. The problem with static textures is that they can be jarring if you don't introduce them early on as a style rule. You need to set up that static textures are something that can happen in the world of your project. Another small downside to static textures is you might be kind of limited in terms of texture type. It works best, in my opinion, with small, repetitive, and stylized textures. You'll also want to avoid putting around high-detailed areas that need to read easily, such as a character's face. This technique tends to lend itself best to clothes and accents rather than a character's primary color. Here I have a spinning wiener rotoscoped fresh from Blender. So the coloring is all done. I have a texture in here to overlay over the whole thing once it's time to render, but I want to do a little bit more with it. So I'm going to add a texture to the shadow, the relish, and the mustard. I already designed my textures for this, but when you're designing your own, you're going to want to make sure that the texture is big enough to cover all of the screen that the object you're going to fill ever touches. Because these are static textures, you can't move them around, so it has to be relatively big, usually a small design repeated over multiple times. So I'm going to right-click in my palette, go to New Texture, and these are all the textures I'm going to be using. I've already brought in the tone for the background. Okay. So here they all are. I'm going to make sure I'm on my wiener layer. And first, I'm going to select the mustard color. Go back to my selection tool, and I'm going to turn on Apply to All Frames. I'll right-click, select Strokes with Current Color, and now I've selected all of my mustard from every single frame. Scroll down to my new mustard texture, click on it, and then I'm going to go to Edit Gradient/Texture. Now, I can move around the texture and it will change it for every single frame. Let's see how that looks. It's a bit stretched out, so I'm gonna shrink it down. And that's about right for the mustard. And as you can see, the texture is static throughout the entire animation. I'm going to do the same with the relish. Select my green color, select Strokes with Current Color, choose my relish texture, and adjust it using the Gradient and Texture tool. Making sure that the texture covers every single frame, so there's nothing cut out. That's looking good, and the last piece, I'll go to the shadow, select again, and repeat the same process. So that's all for static textures. It's a pretty easy process, and that's what's so great about it. Our next texture technique is track textures. With the right care, these can look really great. There's a huge style flexibility. You can use them for basically any texture, however, it does take quite a bit longer. It adds a whole new pass to your process, and it can be difficult to get it looking right. The effort to result ratio can vary a lot on these, so it's really up to you to decide whether they're worth it based on the circumstances you have. It's best to prioritize and only use them where you feel they'll be most effective. For instance, a pupil texture is super easy and it can look great. Tracking on cloth, however, and other squishy objects is another story. When animating objects like those, it's more about getting it to feel right than actually making the texture match up perfectly every frame, because the object bends so much, you just won't be able to do that. You'll have to spend a lot of time fiddling to get it to feel right, but if you have the time to do that, it can be really rewarding. Okay, so I have this little animation here. It's all done in terms of line work, and it's ready to be colored, of this little kitten jumping out and walking across the screen. Now, I want to take this animation here, loop it, and offset it, so it's a line of kittens walking behind each other, each with an individual color and pattern. So, I have all of the kittens I want already designed, so I'm going to take these designs, I'm going to render them out, and I'm going to bring them into Krita, which is basically like Photoshop. And I'm also going to take one frame from my actual animation, and that's what I will paint my textures over. Okay, so we're in Krita. I have my little cat template that I'm going to be painting over, and I have all of my designs for reference. So, we're not going to be making just one texture per design. We're going to need a texture for every single part that moves independently from one another and has different coloration than the part it's attached to. In that case, this would typically mean I'll need one for the base of the head, everything that goes above that, like the eyes and the ears. I'll need one for the base body, and for each of the legs and the tail. Now, for the boots and the scarf, I may just do a flat color. Now, we may need less or more textures for each depending on the design. For this one, I may not need to have textures for the legs, because they'll just match up with the same texture as the bottom of the body. I may even avoid trying to put stripes on the legs on designs like this, so that they'll just be the base color of the body, and I won't need to individually color them. So I'm going to go through, create each of those textures on a separate layer, and we'll check back in. Okay, so I finished up painting each part for all of my designs. It looks like a big mess. That's because I've drawn quite a bit extra for each of these parts. That's because these characters are drawn animation, and the shapes will change as they move. So you need to take into account all that extra space that will need to be filled. That'll make a little bit more sense once we start actually coloring the characters. So here I have the body and the tail, and you can see that wherever we have two textures that are going to overlap, you want to have an area where they can cross over, where it's probably just one solid color, so that when you actually fill them in and they come up to meet each other, you don't get any weird clipping or harsh lines that you don't want. So we'll go through the rest. We have the back leg, the head, the eye, the front arm as we'll call it. We won't need a back arm because it's just going to fall into the body color. And the front back leg. So I'm going to render out each of these parts individually without this template here on top of it, and I'm going to put them in a folder for all of my textures, and we'll start bringing those in to color in Toon Boom. As I'm rendering, I want to make sure not to move or zoom in on any of these parts so that they all line up with the template in the exact same way. That way, once I'm done coloring the first kitten, I'll just be able to copy it and transfer over the textures, and hopefully they'll all line up about right. Okay, so I'm back in my scene, and I'm going to start coloring in every part of this kitten that's going to use a texture. To do this, I'm just going to use a bright temporary color that's really easy to tell apart from the background. Okay, now that I've filled in all the parts that are going to be using texture, I'm going to import my textures. I'm just going to right-click in my palette, New Texture, and I'm going to go to the folder that I have all of my textures in for Kitten 1. I'm going to select all of these and click Open. Now, all of my textures are in the scene. Something you'll want to watch out for is textures changing size as the animation goes by. In order to avoid this, I'm going to go to Apply to All Frames, select my temporary color, and select Strokes with Color. Now I'm going to start out tracking just one texture in all of this, so that hopefully the rest will follow the same scale. I'm going to want to choose the one that's the easiest to track. Right now, I think that is probably the head. So I'm going to click on head, and now all of these have been replaced with it. Obviously, it's not lining up right now. So let's go through. We're going to go to the white arrow, click into the side, and go to Edit Gradient or Texture. Now, since we have all of them still selected, this will change the size of this texture for every single frame. We're going to scale it up so that it fits. Now, because there's quite a bit of extra drawing here, it is a bit hard to tell where it's actually supposed to go, so I might flip between a few of these textures to see how it's lining up. The one that might help me the most right now is probably the eye. So that's relatively close to where I want it to be. but I might move it forward just a little bit. And I'm going to flip it to the eye again to see where that's lining up. That's about where I want it. Now that I'm happy with the scaling of the head, I'm going to turn off Apply to All Frames, make sure the head texture is selected, and continue going through my scene, selecting strokes with that color, and adjusting the rotation and position to match the head. When you do this, it's important to select all the texture fill rather than just the head. This will make it easier on you later to add the body and leg textures, since they'll already be closer to where you want them to be. Okay, so now I basically have the head tracked, so I'm going to go through and do the body. For this next pass, you want to include every part but the head in the body, so that means the legs and the tail too, even though they have a separate texture, because we'll deal with those last. So, in each frame, you'll select the part that corresponds with the body, and just click the body texture. Now, since we were tracking everything, including the head, before, the body will be much closer to where it should be than the head was originally, although since the head bobs a lot more, there will be quite a bit of rotation still to fix. So we're going to go through every frame and switch it over, and then, like with the head, we will go through, select the gradient and texture editor, and adjust the rotation of the body. Now, for something that extends and compresses as much as the body, don't be afraid to squish the texture around a little bit to match. I typically like to choose 1 or 2 anchor points to look at while I'm tracking, such as the base of the tail and the end of the leg. That way, if you get those 2 points matching up most of the time, you'll avoid flickering and things will usually play pretty smoothly. Now that I've gotten the body texture tracking, I'm going to duplicate the kitten layer, go to the new layer, select the color of my line work, do Apply to All Frames, and then select Strokes with Current Color. Now I'm going to invert it and delete all the textures so that I've isolated my line work to the top layer. Now I'm going to go through and delete all the line work from my texture layer. Now that I have just the textures isolated on the bottom layer, I'm going to select my cutter tool and use that to switch over the parts that are supposed to be the tail to the tail texture, the parts that are supposed to be the front leg to the front leg texture, or arm as I called it, and the parts that are supposed to be the back leg to the back leg texture, and so on. Oops. And then I'll go through and I'll track those with the same technique as I did with the body. Because of the way that the stripes line up on the back leg, I know I'll have to adjust the seams a little bit, but that's alright since I have all the line work on a separate layer and it'll be easy to move the vertices around. Now all of my textures are in, but even though I planned for it in the design, sometimes the seams just end up messy, so I'm going to go through now with a soft brush and just cover up any of the awkwardness. Okay, so our first little kitten is all colored in. I'm not going to show the entire process of coloring in the other kittens, but I do want to show the benefits of switching out textures to improve coloring speed. So let's duplicate these 2 layers, my line work and my textures. Gonna bring them up and we're going to hide the originals. So now let's see what happens when I import textures from the most similar kitten. Let's see. This should be it. We're importing the textures from kitten 4. So I have the body, the eye, the head, the back, and the tail. So, first of all, let's select the eye. We have apply to all frames selected. I'm going to select strokes with current color. Now, I'm going to go down to kitten 4 eye and switch the textures. And now we have the brown eye from kitten 4. I'm going to do the same with the head, back, and tail, and then we'll see what that gets us. And here we are. It's not perfect, the leg textures will probably need to be completely redone, but as far as the head, tail, and back go, the tracking is basically already done for me, and it'll speed up the process quite a bit. So that's all we have on tracking textures right now. Let's move on to the next technique. Okay, our third and final technique, puppets. For this, there's no tracking necessary, but it is a very distinct style choice. It'll require a slightly different skill set than drawn animation, and it'll limit design options as well. Essentially, the texture is pre-designed into your character in this one, and once you're done with it, you'll just bring in the character and start moving it around. Typically, you only see the character from one angle, and it may appear stiff in animation. However, that's part of the appeal of the style. So, I have this harpy puppet I've designed here. There are a couple of differences when designing for puppets versus 2D animation. One of them is that every single part that's going to move on its own needs to be on its own layer. And you're going to want to draw the entirety of that object, whether it's hidden by something or not in this pose, because it's not going to stay in the same pose for all of animation. The amount of complexity you want to put into this really depends on what you want to do with your animation. For instance, these toes here are all on the same layer for each foot, so I'm not going to have them move individually. However, for the hair, I have it in a whole bunch of different layers, so I can do some more complex overlapping action. Now, everywhere there's a joint where something is going to bend, you're going to want to make sure it ends in a rounded shape rather than just a hard cutoff. That way, when it bends, it won't be a sharp edge sticking out. Okay, so there are a couple of ways that you can bring this into Toon Boom. One of them is by using the textures like we did before. That takes us a lot longer, and you have to render out every single layer individually. However, one upside it has is that if you later change one part of the puppet, like you change the color or something, it's very easy just to import that back in and it'll replace all of the texture instantly. However, because it's faster and I'm pretty sure that this puppet is final in the way that I want it to look, I'm just going to do it the quicker way. So, I'm going to save this. Again, I'm using Krita, so this is not Photoshop, but I'm going to save it as a Photoshop image, because Toon Boom can actually import Photoshop images layer by layer. So I'm just going to save that as Harpy. So we're in Toon Boom. I'm going to go over to File, Import, Images. I'm going to go find the PSD file we just saved. There it is. Open it. Make sure the settings are right. Create layers based on file names. Import as Toon Boom bitmap drawing. Now, because of my screen, I actually can't click OK. It's awful, but so I'm just going to click off and click Enter. Hopefully you won't have to deal with that. So now it recognizes that I'm bringing in a PSD, so it brings up the multi-layer image import. So create individual layers, transparency straight, those should both work. So let's click OK. And now it might take a while because it has to bring in all of the layers. Perfect. So the first thing I'm going to actually do is just go through and delete all the things I don't need. Don't need the background, and this wing here is actually just a stand-in. So I'm going to delete that. And this one, I'm going to animate, and once I'm done animating it, I'm just going to copy that entire thing and flip it. Now we're going to go through and start grouping together these parts in the way that they would naturally follow each other. we're going to use pegs to animate just because it's a clean and organized way of doing things. There is one typical structure that will work for most two-legged characters, but I found that the best way to get there is to just take things as they come. So the first thing we're going to do is select every single one of our layers and create a peg. For the sake of looking at it, I'm going to go through and collapse each one of these right now, since it'll be easier to work with. So now, every single one of these layers can be animated individually. The only problem is, this is not really bending from the right spot right now, so we're going to have to go through and use this tool to adjust the peg. We'll move it to where the item should bend from. For the head, that's right at the end of the neck. So now when we go back to the transform tool, it'll rotate from the right spot. You'll have to do this with every single layer on your puppet, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to do that in this tutorial. Most of it's just basic logic, kind of like the song, arm bone connects to the leg bone connects to the neck bone, whatever. So now we're going to go through and start creating our peg hierarchy. Since the head's at the top, we'll start there. The head usually follows the rotation of the neck, so we're going to create a new peg and call it head neck. We'll find the neck peg and move it up so that both the head and neck pegs are underneath head neck. Now, when we go in, adjust the peg of the head neck, and come back out, we can rotate all of them together, but we can still rotate the head and neck separately too. Just like that. Now, we'll also want the hair under that, so we're going to go down to the top hair layer to create a hair peg. We'll select all the hair layers and put it underneath that peg. Now, we'll drag it up underneath the head neck peg and put it at the bottom. Now, we obviously don't want the hair to go over the chest. So, first we're going to go through to the Z position of the hair and say -0.2. And now it's behind the chest, even though technically as a layer it's above it. Now that our head is ready, we're going to move on to the torso. So again, select head neck, a new peg, call it torso. So the head, neck, chest, and waist will all be under the torso, but we need the wings as well, so let's go and find the top wing layer. Here it is, wing base. I'm going to create a peg, call it wing left, select all of the wing layers, bring it underneath that peg, bring that peg underneath torso. Now, I'm also going to want to pair head neck underneath chest. To do this, I'm going to create a new peg for the chest layer and call the old chest layer chest head. I'll use this peg if I want to make the character look like they're rotating forward in space. It doesn't look so great right now, but if you do it in time with animation, it's a good trick to create the illusion of depth. So let's move chest above the head. And now, if I wanted my character to bend forward, I would do something like this. We'll put them back to the original position for now. So now, we have our torso. Let's go through and readjust the wings. So, our wing base is typically not going to move separately from the rest, as it's the one that everything else is going to follow. So, we're going to go to wingtip and adjust the peg to where it meets the wing base. So now, when I go to my transform tool, it can move like this. Now, the reason I have all these other feather layers is that I'm going to need them to fold in onto themselves like a fan, so I'm just going to have to go through and adjust them separately as time goes on. However, I'm going to create a new peg called tip, just to organize them a bit more. So, all the feathers that are on the final joint, I'm going to put underneath tip, so that I have to do a little bit less adjustment later on. Next is the legs. So we'll select the first thigh, create a peg called leg right. Select the thigh, calf, foot base, and toes, and put them all under that. We'll reposition the peg so it now bends from the right place. But now we're going to want to make sure the bottom of the leg also bends correctly. So create a new peg called leg lower. And under that will be the calf, foot base, and toes. And now, the toes will also need to go under the foot base peg. So we'll create a new peg called foot to pair them together. Readjust the peg rotation. And now, everything's bending correctly. We'll do the same with the other leg, but I'll just do that off screen. Readjust the peg for the tail. And now, for the most part, we're ready. The final peg we'll need to create is just a peg for the entire character. We'll call it Harpy, and put everything underneath. So now our character is pretty much ready to animate. To animate, I typically like to start out with the broadest layers and move down to the most specific. In this case, the broadest layer would be the entire character layer, and maybe the most specific would be something like each individual piece of hair. So, let's do a really rough pass at it. I want to make a wing flap cycle, so I'm going to start out with the character right here and have her move up a little bit. And then, I'm just going to have her return to the original position so that I can loop it. I'm not going to worry too much about timing right now. So now that I have that, I'm going to go down to my torso layer. And now we're going to do that little trick I talked about with the chest, to make it look like she's bending forward in space. When you're animating, you're going to want to make sure that your drawing is always highlighted in yellow, because you're going to only want to use the peg layers. You don't want to accidentally animate on your drawing layer, because it'll just make things a little bit messy. When your drawing layer is selected, it'll turn pink. That's how you know you have something selected you don't want. So now we're going to move on to the wing layer and have her do a really rough flap. The wing tip will rotate. And again, all of these feather layers, I'll have to readjust based on the position at the very end. The legs may drag in a bit. And we'll add maybe a bit of overlapping action on the tail. So now, I'm going to go through, select all these pegs, copy them, and paste them at the end to loop it. So now, it is not great. The tail has some serious problems, so let me fix that. But overall, we have a very, very rough version of our animation. You'll start out with something like this and move down to the more specific details. It may take a while to get used to if you've only ever done drawn animation, but as with anything, practice makes perfect, and you'll get used to it as you go on. So that was all I have right now on textures in Toon Boom. All of these methods have their own place, and none are inherently better than others. It's all about how you use them and what your own personal taste is. Personally, I feel that mixing and matching will often give you the best results. It gives you a lot more freedom in animation, and it means you can customize your style a lot more. In Operago, I used tracking for the eyes and static for the cloth. My other film, Pharos, was a huge mix of all three. I definitely recommend playing around with different combinations and seeing where it takes you. Let me know in the comments if this was helpful at all, you have something else you'd like to see, you have questions, or if you really wish I would just stick to posting animation. Thank you so much for watching, and also, everyone who's watched Operago, thank you so much for how kind you've been. It's really inspiring, and it definitely makes me want to do more of the characters in the future. Bye-bye!